And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. On a regular basis, we go to universities to talk to professors who are also authors. Right now, we're at Columbia University in New York City, and we're joined by Professor Richard John, who is the author of this book, Network Nation, Inventing American Telecommunications. So, Professor John, Samuel Morse invented the telegraph, yes or no?
No.
All right, why are we taught that as school children then?
Well, we love tales of heroic inventors. And it turns out one reason we love those tales is because they fit the needs of the promoters who were actually developing the networks that would prove so enormously important in 19th century American communications and indeed in communications today. So yes, Samuel Morse was a gifted inventor who had the good fortune to have a college classmate who became patent commissioner, who granted him an extremely broad patent right that enabled him to try to monopolize the telegraph business. He didn't succeed, but that was at least the basis for the claims that have swirled around him, claims that, surprisingly enough, were then picked up by his arch rival, the second generation telegraph promoters, Western Union, who used those claims in order to buttress their own legitimacy as a corporation. So it's quite a tangled story. But no, Samuel Morse did not invent the telegraph, and Alexander Graham Bell did not invent the telephone.
How did Alexander Graham Bell not invent the telephone?
Well, Alexander Graham Bell was one of a number of very talented individuals in the 1870s who became part of a sort of a competitive struggle involving Western Union, which was then the leading dominant telegraph network provider, and Jay Gould, who was a promoter who had behind him a very small but very effective, at least for his purposes, telegraph company. And so you have two companies that are competing with each other for inventions that they can turn into patent rights and they can use as sort of chits in a competitive struggle. And Bell was part of that. He wanted to invent the telephone, but his primary backer, who would soon become his father-in-law, Gardner Green Hubbard, wanted him to develop what we could now call a broadband telegraph. And in fact, it was only when he did develop such a device that his backer, Hubbard, permitted him to go on and do his research on the telephone. And had that telephone patent been not part of a bundle that became a part of American Bell, which eventually became AT&T, we might not have heard of Alexander Graham Bell. So the inventors are operating in a very distinctive political economy in which their own inventive genius is only part of the story, and indeed a relatively small part of the story.
So, Richard John, how would you compare a Samuel Morse or an Alexander Graham Bell to a Steve Jobs or a Bill Gates today?
Well, they're very different. Morse was an unsuccessful entrepreneur. Bell did not wish to be an entrepreneur, and Gates and Jobs are very successful entrepreneurs. And in some ways, Morse is the most revealing. He's the most revealing contrast because he very much wanted to rely on the last generation's templates for how to organize a business, to rely on the federal government. He wanted to sell his telegraph patents to the federal government and then basically get out of the way. And when that failed, he tried to license his telegraph patents very selectively. But this proved impossible. He did not have, the federal government proved unable to provide him with the kind of protection he needed in order to pursue his business. In the case of Gates, he famously had the very great good fortune to stumble upon the computer business, software business, at just the moment when IBM was looking for a developer. And IBM gave him the kind of running room that the federal government didn't give Morse.
So, are you saying telecommunications in the U.S. has been regulated since day one?
Yes.
Was Samuel Morse, was the telegraph highly regulated?
The communications networks have always been highly regulated in this country, but they've been regulated in different ways. In the case of the telegraph, the original idea was for the telegraph to be coordinated like the post office. Morse tried for several years to sell his patent rights to Congress, and only when Congress refused to purchase his patent rights did he go on and develop his own really unsuccessful network of telegraph companies. In the case of the telephone, it developed in a very different political economy. The rules of the game matter, and they're different for the telegraph and the telephone. In the case of the telephone, the rules of the game mandated that you have to establish municipal franchise companies, and by doing so, you are obliged to follow all kinds of rules and regulations right from the start. Whereas the successful telegraph companies, the second generation, not Morse, but the generation that followed Morse, they operated in a political economy with minimal rules, but there were still rules. There always have been rules, and there always will be rules. It's just too important a sector, and it's too bound up with all kinds of property rights, eminent domain, patent rights, for it ever to be like, say, a lemonade stand. And that's the case in the past, and that's the case in the present. And that's really one of the main themes of the book, is the extent to which the political structures within which communication networks evolve shape the business strategies of the promoters who actually develop those networks. So structure shapes strategy.
So, Professor, how does the internet fit today into that regulation structure?
Well, contrary to the assumptions that show up in popular books, the internet was not invented in anybody's garage, and neither was the World Wide Web. The internet is a federal government Cold War project. And what's remarkable about the internet, really, if you think about it, was that no corporation would have taken it on. And indeed, it really was only possible in a relatively short period of time, when you are trying to economize on scarce computer processing space. So you have cheaper long-distance telephone lines than you have computer processing space. And you need this computer processing space because you're trying to compute missile firings. All right? And so that was the impetus that led these Cold War scientists to try to put together this remarkable network that really didn't have a commercial rationale. And that's really part of the wonder of it, is that it was not developed with a particular business model in mind. And so we've been having, really since the 1990s, to develop successful business models, which has been part of the astonishment of watching it develop. So yes, highly regulated from the beginning, remains highly regulated today. Even the idea of creating a level playing field or network neutrality is a particular set of regulatory arrangements. And I think it's important that not only those of us who care about the history of communication networks, but those of us who care about the future of communication networks recognize that the relevant issues is not between regulation and no regulation, different kinds of regulation, and different kinds of regulation promote different kinds of innovation. And that's really part of the story of Network Nation.
Who founded Western Union?
Well, Western Union, as its name implies, was a sort of a combine of small telegraph lines that were in, well, the Midwest, between New York, Ohio, Michigan. And if there was to be one hero, one central figure, it would be Hiram Sibley, who was a promoter from upstate New York. And what Hiram Sibley did, he really did two things that made him distinctive. The first thing he did was that he was able to convince a number of merchants and other capitalists in Rochester, New York, to invest in what had then, at that time, looked like a failed venture, that is to say, telegraph corporations. There were, because of the way the laws were set up, there were telegraph corporations hither, thither, and yon, and almost none of them were making money. So he convinces his Rochester, New York buddies, the men who'd helped him. He was a poor boy, came to New York, he'd been helped by these wealthier merchants. He says, I've got a great idea. And they're very skeptical. But he convinces them to put a lot of money into this corporation that becomes known as Western Union, which he will then, he will use that capital to kind of buy up a number of companies. Now, the second key insight, or the second key innovation of Sibley's, besides just getting together a certain amount of capital, and that's all the capital he ever needed to raise, at that one point in time. The other key innovation of Sibley's was that he figured out a way to get some of the benefits of monopoly in a political economy in which state governments were encouraging the establishment of lots and lots of telegraph companies. And what he did was he established exclusive right-of-way contracts with individual railroads. So if you can get an exclusive contract, say between, Detroit and Chicago along a particular railroad line, you are able to maintain that line at a much cheaper cost than would be your rival who would be having to use roads or be